today's brown bag is going to take place in two halves. I'm going to present the first half, and then I think Anthony is presenting in the second half. I'm going to divide my talk into two halves further. The first part being, I'm going to introduce you to the kind of the theory and some of the ideas and initial studies that we've run that support the EOI that we're submitting, and that will help set the scene for the studies that we're proposing. So I'm presenting on behalf of Phil and Rob, Rich and Jasper, and other members of our team as well have collaborated on this project, which we've called at the moment the Perceived Conditions for Living Well, linking primary goods with basic psychological needs and wellness. So our initial studies and the proposal that we're submitting as a result is both psychologically and philosophically informed by self-determination theory and by the philosophy of John Rawls. Now, of course, everyone in the room is really across self-determination theory, so I won't spend any of my precious time outlining any of SDT, but I will spend a bit of time outlining the philosophy of Rawls. You appreciate not having SDT stuff.
This was when SDT was a young theory.
Oh, that's not nice.
Yeah, there's an age differential there.
But I will spend some time outlining the theory of John Rawls, and then I'll come back around and link it to the psychology at the end. So, John Rawls' theory of justice had within it a discussion of primary goods. He emphasised the importance of primary goods for flourishing, for well-being, for the members of the community, country, society. And the definition of primary goods is the social provisions or elements, functions, the affordances provided by society and the community that afford people's wellness. And he proposed there were 5. Basic rights and liberties, so this is everyone treated fairly under the law? Do rights equally treat everybody? Freedom of movement and occupation, so can I travel where I want? Can I choose to go, but can I go independently? Can I go on my own? And also, can I choose hobbies and a vocation? Can I choose hobbies and a vocation as opposed to having it dictated to me? Power of office and authority. So Rawls thought about this on both sides. So am I able to actively and democratically participate in systems of power? Can I vote? But also, do I have equal access to power if I should want it? Could I run for office and be seen as a credible candidate? Adequate standards of living, so this is all pretty basic standards of care. Do I have access to water? Do I have access to food? Am I relatively safe? Do I have enough money? And the social basis of self-respect. So are people like me discriminated against, or are most people and different diverging groups thought of and considered the same within the society? So I think you'll agree that this is a pretty intuitive philosophy. It makes sense that getting more of these things, that people would want more of these things rather than less, and then in getting more, they'd be better off. But it actually has attracted relatively little empirical or quantitative attention. So I guess addressing that gap is something we were interested in doing. Answering this claim of, if you get more primary goods, do you get more well-being? And if your primary goods go down, do you get less well-being or more ill-being? So in addition to those claims, we're obviously expecting as people perceive their access to primary goods as going up, does that link to well-being? And if they perceive their primary goods as going down, does that link with ill-being? We also proposed or made specific claims in our studies about the mechanisms that would underlie some of those two proposed pathways. In particular, we proposed that increases in perceptions of primary goods, and perception is an important thing for me to note at this point, because of course in countries, particularly Western democratic countries, are becoming increasingly improving in the degree to which they provide people with access to primary goods at the legislative level. but we're more interested in the degree to which people perceive that access. So even if you are treated equally under the law, do you feel that you are treated equally under the law? So perception of primary goods rather than government level or legal level primary goods is what we're interested in. And anyway, back to the point I was making on this slide is we expected that increases in primary goods would lead to increases in basic psychological need satisfaction, and that increase would result in well-being. On the flip side, if you perceived yourself as having low primary goods, that would lead to basic psychological need frustration, and that would be the mechanism leading to ill-being. So we tested these claims, the basic correlational claims, and also the mediation claims, though we did it cross-sectionally, so I'm reluctant to use the word mediation, and I know that I need to do so with caution. But in 2 studies, this is the first, we tested this model using partial least squares structural equation modelling because the primary goods variables are formative, not reflective, and partial least squares, PLSM, makes less assumptions about the data. And it has indeed different requirements for the data. So in a reflective model, the items that measure a latent construct should be highly correlated with each other and interchangeable, whereas in a formative measure, the items lead to the construct and should not be interchangeable, leading to kind of a breadth in the construct. It should measure a broad construct. So anyway, that's not necessary if you understand what's going on here, but I just wanted you to know what this is. It's a PLSM model where we show see strong positive links between primary goods and basic psychological need satisfaction, strong negative links between primary goods and basic psychological need frustration, and then a variety of direct and indirect links to 3 well-being and 3 ill-being outcomes. Basically, this is a sample of 762 people from a variety of countries: America, India, the Philippines, Australia, and South Africa. And we found that for all of the well-being variables, basic psychological need fulfillment was at least a partial mediator, and in many cases a full mediator for the link with well-being, and a partial mediator for 2 of the, so a partial mediator for 3 of the ill-being variables, and a complete and a full mediator for anxiety. How do I put this in? Oh yes, so we did. That was just I already said what I was saying. Basically, we can see that the direct effects in the presence of the mediator become non-significant for almost all of the variables across almost all of the 5 countries, except for in the case of satisfaction with life, that appears to be both indirect and direct. And then we sought to replicate that in, this is in a sample of just Americans, so where we had taken this cross-national perspective in the first study, we wanted to zoom in a bit more and look at intra-country group level differences in perceptions of primary goods. This is a sample of 1,479 Americans, and these people had to identify as belonging to a particular group in order to be able to participate. So we had people who self-identified as belonging to a racial minority, sexual minority, a religious group, or a political group. And found this is treating everyone, this is pooling the data and looking at everybody. So again, similar patterns of results, very positive links with satisfaction, negative links with frustration, and a variety of direct and indirect paths with well-being and ill-being. Here, this is males and females. There were no differences between males and females in the first study, so I didn't include them. But here we can see that the indirect effect of basic psychological needs is mixed for males, more pervasive for, consistent for females, but inconsistent for males. And males also have a higher perception of primary goods. I'm yet to link those 2 facts, but it seems in this example, if your perception of primary goods is higher, it's links that the indirect effect of needs is less. I'm not quite sure what that means yet. We're still working on that. And then we looked at it at the looked at perceptions of primary goods at the group level, finding that the ethnic minority and the sexual minority had less perceived primary goods in all domains than the religious and the political group across the board. But there were no differences between the ethnic minority and the sexual minority, and no differences between the political group and the religious group. So there appears to be some detrimental quality about belonging to a minority group, and a more protective quality about belonging to a political or religious group. Again, still need to interpret that a bit further. But again, you can see here that the indirect effects of needs fulfillment are still very consistent across groups and across variables. But obviously we've got some questions here. I keep saying I don't know about that, I don't know about that as I move my way through. So we are proposing now an EOI that includes, it actually includes 7 studies to dive deeper into some of these constructs and examine them in a number of different contexts. So the first is looking at perceptions of primary goods in Indigenous groups. Now the philosophy of John Rawls is obviously very Western liberal, so important for us to embed our understanding of primary goods within Indigenous groups, or maybe not even just Indigenous groups, but groups for whom that Western liberal perspective may be less important or qualitatively understood differently. So in this first study, we're proposing working with collaborators in New Zealand and in Peru, in Indigenous groups in these countries, to examine their perceptions of primary goods, both at the qualitative level using a reciprocal mapping approach, and then at the quantitative level. So we would obviously need requisite comparison groups from the majority group in each of these countries to see if the minority groups do indeed have lower, and if primary goods are more or less important for those groups. And then study 3 is cross-cultural perceptions of primary goods. So here we have proposed a study where we would be recruiting a sample of students studying in Australia who are from overseas. And it may require some massaging in terms of the semantics and the measure, but we'd be interested in finding out how they perceive their primary goods while they're here versus how they perceive their primary goods in their country of origin. And would probably expect some differences depending on what that country of origin is. So, I mean, is it more intrapersonal, or is it really quite circumstantial, the degree to which you perceive your primary goods as being satisfied? Study 4, individual differences in primary goods in primary goods perception. So here we'll be looking at a number of different possible individual level influences in the degree to which you perceive your primary goods as being satisfied or not satisfied. So first is how do people close to you perceive the degree to which they had their primary goods satisfied? And does that influence yours? So if you're rating your primary goods as very positively correlated with the primary goods of people immediately near you. How does it relate to your life experiences? So if you belong to a certain group for whom we might expect primary goods to be low, but you've never had an experience of discrimination or anything like that, perhaps these life experiences play also a role in the degree to which you think you and your group have more or less primary goods. Self-stigma, so this is an important one for us. So, and I'll put the other one up as well, so because then there's these two are kind of the opposite sides of the same coin. So we would expect self-stigma versus authenticity to have opposing influences on the degree to which you have good perceptions of your own primary goods. If you belong to a group and you have internalized the stigma of belonging to that group, it would probably lead to you having a lower perception of primary goods, whereas if you're more authentic and you have integrated your group memberships, it's more likely to result in you having a higher perception of primary goods. So in addition to looking at where we have really focused thus far in group level differences in primary goods, this would be looking at more individual level influences. Study 5, can primary goods perceptions be influenced? So this would be following on from if we find, for example, that certain life experiences have an influence in the degree to which people think their primary goods they have good satisfaction with the degree to which their primary goods are being met, can that be manipulated? So perhaps it's the case if you belong to a particular minority group. Let's just use women as an example. Women are not a minority group, but let's just use them anyway.
Majority.
They are the majority. A previously oppressed group such as women, and arguably still oppressed. Let's not go there. Stop. We could take evidence in the media, a discussion in the media, narrative from the media, and manipulate experimentally whether exposure to that kind of content results in an increase in the degree to which people think they have good or bad primary goods. So perhaps you might have the same, I might have the same experience as another female, and if I'm in a condition where it's made salient to me in exposure to written and television content that women are oppressed, perhaps my feelings of primary good satisfaction will go down versus someone who wasn't exposed to that. It's going to be interesting for us to know if this is just experiential or if you can have the degree to which primary goods are satisfied for you, that perception manipulated by content that you are exposed to. Yeah, I probably should have put both of them up because I just gave that whole thing away. And then 6 and 7 will be longitudinal research. So obviously it's important, given that we have a pretty, we're proposing a mediation model here through all of them, that we think that need, satisfaction and frustration are the mechanisms behind the link between primary goods and well-being and ill-being. It's important for us to test it longitudinally. Also, journals are obsessed with longitudinal research, so we're going to need that in order to be publishable. So, building on the 3 cross-sectional studies that we were going to collect in the first place in these Indigenous groups, we'll also be tracking these Indigenous groups over time in conjunction with some of the intra-individual evidence that we find too. So, do perceptions of primary goods for people in these groups fluctuate more over time, and what individual experiences would someone have to have in order to exacerbate or attenuate those fluctuations? And then this is a study that I'm particularly interested in, is linking longitudinally perceptions of primary goods to actual primary goods at the legislative level, using 2 samples, one from Australia and one from Saudi Arabia. The logic here being that there are 2 impending or proposed changes in both of these countries that should be of benefit to groups who would probably perceive their primary goods to be quite low at present. So in Australia, we are discussing having a referendum about making explicit mention of First Peoples in the Constitution. So depending on, I guess, whether that is or is not passed, it would be interesting for us to test Indigenous people's perception of primary goods now, and then perception of primary goods after that referendum happens. We would make different hypotheses depending on the outcome. And in Saudi Arabia, they're talking about similar things at the moment with regards to so-called male governance laws. In Saudi Arabia, women can't have a driver's license or travel without permission or travel alone. And they're currently talking about loosening some of those laws and lifting some of them. So once again, it would be interesting to test females' perceptions of primary goods now, and then perceptions of primary goods after those laws are changed. I would also actually be interested in changes in perceptions, in primary good perceptions from the men in Saudi Arabia. I think almost explicitly in some of the logic behind these male governance laws is that, I don't know, if women are let to run loose, that it'll have some detrimental impact on men. So it would be useful to demonstrate that in the face of loosening male governance laws, that men don't get worse off, or perhaps if women get better off, there's some kind of contagion effect, and in fact men become better off as well. That's all the studies. I hope I haven't run over time. I realised I was prattling a little bit there, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Fascinating, fascinating. I'm interested in this concept of primary goods. What is that? So are there non-primary goods? And related to that, I mean, for most of them it's likely a dimensional issue, right? Having more or less of them, food, money, whatever, right? A third question would then be, I mean, wouldn't they behave differently? So you lump them together in one latent construct, right? But wouldn't it make a difference for need satisfaction and for the satisfaction of different needs if it's about food, money, access to power, and so on?
Oh, you mean like a third layer? So obviously there's five subscales within the global primary goods variable, and they have been constructed hierarchically. So even though it's a single variable in the SEN models, that is comprised of a second order model that includes the degree to which each subscale contributes to the higher order construct. If
so it's a higher order formative.
Yeah, that's right. It's a second order formative latent construct. Yeah.
Yeah, but isn't that one level 2 removed from the causal mechanisms that really then are in effect in reality?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I have actually looked at it. I mean, you can run the mediation models, including the indirect effect of one of the specific primary goods subscales on well-being and ill-being mediated by needs, taking out that higher order construct, and the effects just become sort of confusing actually, certainly not as consistent. But in answer to the first point in your question, are there non-primary needs?
Goods.
Primary goods, yeah, thanks. I haven't made the claim and wouldn't make the claim that this conception of primary goods is necessarily all-inclusive. It's philosophically bound. It's not bound. We have opted to align our research with the philosophy, but would be open to it being expanded.
I would say if they're non-primary goods, then the concept is empty, right?
If they're non-primary goods, so can you say more?
I mean, if all goods are primary goods, then we can skip the primary, and then it's about goods.
It's obviously not primary goods.
Which ones?
Oh, so I mean, in Rawls's definition, a primary good is the kind of thing that someone would always want more of and never less of. So I guess if you could think of another good that someone could want more of and someone else might want less of for different reasons, then it wouldn't meet his philosophical criteria for primary good.
It's actually, it actually has a procedure for identifying these. It's called the veil of ignorance. And so the way it works is that you have to consider, independent of your own position in society, whatever your current thing is, what would be the rights that you would want to guarantee anybody in that society.
Okay.
So it's not about just what you want, it's about what you believe anybody would want, regardless of their position in a culture. And this is the procedure through which he arrived at the primary goals.
Okay.
Yeah.
And very few things would then meet that criteria. That's a pretty strong criteria which rules out a lot.
Okay, got it.
But it's a philosophical thought experiment. It's not empirically tested.
Right. Well, it has been.
It has been empirically tested.
It has been.
It doesn't hold up, but it has been proven.
Particularly when you bring in the distinction between actual primary goods and perceived primary goods, you obviously are bringing in the frame of reference effects.
That's true.
And there would be, you can't ignore that in the research. I mean, you may not be able to look at it, but I think that the agenda was looking at some stuff that if you're the least disadvantaged in an advantaged group, you think that's a good thing.
Highly of yourself, yeah, sure.
And so I'm sure that you can look at that informally within some of your groups, but it would be interesting to try and look at that more directly.
How do you do that? That's a question for another time, but yes, no, I'm definitely keen.
Well, that's
to
my big
how to do
fish,
that.
little pond effect.
No, I understand the theory. I mean more, how do you test it? I mean, I theoretically I understand the big fish little pond effect, but how to actually analyze it, I don't. So yeah, that's what I'd be interested in, because obviously an increase in, say, women in Saudi Arabia's perception of primary goods would be good in isolation, and also the gap between them and men becomes smaller, so that should be additionally good according to the big fish little pond effect.
Well, it may well be that people's perceptions of what they need for to satisfy their primary goods moves more than the reality, in which case their perception would actually go backwards.
Right.
I'm just making that up.
Yeah, sure.
But those are the sorts of paradoxes that you get. I overuse that word.
I think the two of these questions, though. I mean, because the big fish holds up because of the self-evaluative component to it. But a lot of these questions are things like, I can travel where I want without restrictions from the government.
In addition,
those don't have that.
the question isn't I. The question in our measure is people. People are treated equally under the law.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I mean, there's actually a combination, because there's also people like me are discriminated against. So there's a combination.
Okay.
So it's so you've got a mixture of L1 and L2.
Yeah, that's true, that's
that
true.
makes it complicated as well.
Yeah, totally.
Particularly within your groups, you can look at contextual effects.
Sure, that
Yeah.
makes sense, yeah.
People like me items will lend themselves to that kind of
To frame of
analysis.
reference, yeah, sure.
You would just need to identify the frames of reference they are
Items.
actually using, right?
Yes.
What is the, I mean, local dominant frame of reference? What's the groups they are comparing themselves to?
That's true, yeah, yeah, that's
True,
true.
but some of them you've got groups
That
that
they
are
think
self-defined.
groups, that's true.
You know, in one or two of the studies, they've got self-defined groups and
Okay.
the extent to which they identify with that group. Now, whether you can necessarily get a measure of actual primary groups in relation to those groups.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. And I think in most of the countries that, I mean, like we've mostly got Australian and American samples, I think there are very few differences between the degree to which these people are treated. Ethnic minorities, I mean, so like even a sexual minority has previously not had access to same-sex marriage and now does. We have been trying to level the playing field in those domains, but at the legal level, that doesn't necessarily have the effect on perception. Maybe we would hope.
And which parts of these studies are ARC grants that have gone in for the EOIs?
So the results we already have are obviously not part of it, but studies 1 through 7 are part of the ARC.
How do you frame studies 1 to 7 to the ARC? I think my highest number is 4 with the ARC. Trying to get the story to flow with so many studies can be very, very difficult to sell it to the ARC and to get it. How are you going to get the storyline to flow across 7 studies?
So the story thus far, the narrative thus far is country level, group level, individual level, and then contextual influences.
You got
I
some
think
sort
that's a
of
good
dive?
story.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Have you got a diagram
Very
or something that you could show to the ARC
Yeah.
how they're linked?
How the studies flow into each other. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, because remember there's going to be people that are not necessarily experts in your field
Sure.
reading it. Wow, there's 7 studies. Why is there 7?
It's true.
How are they linked? How does each build on? And how are they interrelated? Because I think that's one of the hardest things to try and sell to the ARC when you've got so many, because it gives them more things to pick on.
Sure.
As well, you know, they've got 7 different study designs that they can pick on. So, yeah, but that's good if you've got the story to tell and some sort of image or figure that shows how they're connected that doesn't take up too much space.
Yeah, no, I think the figure's a good suggestion. We've definitely thought about how to structure the narrative in a compelling way, in a sensible way, but I think the figure is a good suggestion.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
I think the other thing is this is social psychology, and social psychologists have 7 studies in a single paper,
paper,
so
yeah,
I don't
that's
think it'd be too unusual to them. I think.
They'll like it.
Well, I think they'll expect it. I think if we had less, they would be unhappy.
It's true.
But the reviewers tend to be diverse. I mean, there's truth to both arguments. ARC reviewers are. You can't count on the fact that all your reviewers will be social psychologists. That's all.
Okay.
That's all.
Anything else?
Great.
Lovely, thanks.
Second one, greetings all. So this is just some quick background. This is one which we redid, which got good reviews, fairly good reviews the first time, but didn't make it. First time around was just myself and John Gunther, who's from Nottingham University, who has expertise in remote education. And then Janet come on board, took the lead, we submitted again, and Rob Rodman as well. So we have a much, it's changed, it's sort of kept some of the same things, but changed a lot and is only better. So that's one we are confident about, given that the last one, although it didn't did get favourable reviews. So just some quick background. So it's about identifying 2 remote communities, Aboriginal remote communities. We've got this generational cycle of disadvantage. So where you see it generation after generation, and if you visit these communities and you see that the children are happy, Do you want to know what they're going to be like in 10, 15 years' time? Just look at the parents who are sitting around, drinking, playing cards, no jobs, fighting, that sort of thing. So you've got this ongoing cycle. How do we break that? And what we will be doing is going in, speaking with people, listening to the people. It uses a model Rhonda and others developed, which is largely SDT-based and positive psychology. We're establishing genuine partnerships with these communities, so each year for the life of the project, 3 years, there'll be at least 3 trips to the community, 5 to 7 days at a time, so it's quite significant the amount of time which we as researchers are spending in the communities to establish genuine partnerships. So we're identifying key people in these communities, elders, service providers, school teachers, doctors, police, youth representation, all those sorts of people. And it's all about giving a voice to the people, letting them just identify problems, but that also requires a bit of a nudge as well, because if you go to these communities where they've got, say, 20 people living in a house, they say, we don't have any problems, things are fine. So it's helping them to realise there's better things available out there, but we still want it to be led without any sort of imposing solutions on them. The 2 communities are in the Northern Territory, Wadair and Yindamu. One of those communities often features in the media for all the wrong reasons. So these are communities that do have problems such as high unemployment, violence, kids not going to school, no future for the kids. And they are fairly remote, where you have to go to a major city and then spend a few hours driving to get to them. Solutions will be Indigenous-led, as I said, but that will require working with them, facilitating workshops and giving people a nudge. It's coming back to Rhonda's model that combines Indigenous knowledges with research methodologies that we're familiar with, such as participatory action research. This new one we've inserted this time, that should be asset-based community development. We're going to identify what we call community champions within these communities, or at least people who have very good relationships with these communities and are nearby, because we can't be there 7 days a week. We'll employ translators because, again, these communities really are remote. For many of the Indigenous people there, they do not speak English, or if they do, it's not their first language, and you can have a lot of problems with understanding and communicating ideas. We focus on so the whole project is centred around what I call this within gap, and we all have heard, most of us have heard about, closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but if you look at just the Indigenous population, within the Indigenous population, you have those who are doing pretty well, who are often city-based Indigenous people, and those who are not doing so well, who live in remote areas, and that's the gap you've got to close. If you just focus on the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, a lot of efforts get focused on those who are already doing well, and those that are in remote communities out of sight and out of mind don't get included. So we're focusing on that gap within the Indigenous population. So just I think the best way to explain the project and what's happening is just to look at the timeline over 3 years, and I'm only giving a very, very brief look at what happens in each year. So, once you've got ethics and all that sort of thing, we're going to the community to establish an advisory board to provide guidance on all aspects of the project, and in a sense, us as researchers will almost appear to be on the outside a little bit. So it'll be very much run on the ground by local people, because they are, we think, in a better position to know what the problems are in their community and what they need. Again, so long as we provide a bit of a nudge to help them think that, those things that you are used to are not so good. Okay. We'll be adopting pro-social. Okay. Second year will be a workshop, so again, held with the key community members to look at, you know, what they identify as problems, what they believe are the goals. We'll be running workshops to establish, okay, what is it you've got that's good, where are the deficits, where are the gaps, and how can we build upon this. This is all culminating, I guess, in an action plan, which is a bit of a vague concept, I know, and what you might want to add at any time. But at the end of it, we do want the community to come up with a plan, what that would look like. I'm not quite sure, and it may be different for each community. But based on everything we've said, a plan which they think will be able to move the community in the right direction. So once they've had a good look at the problems and realise that there are solutions, and it's very easy to become complacent and ignorant about things. So by putting things down in writing in an action plan, it helps, we believe, clarify things. And one of the problems, something I haven't mentioned, is we're looking at working with service providers in these communities as well, because there can be a big disconnect between people and the service providers. By service providers, that could be the local shop owner, for example. So the people think, you know, why does he, you know, charge $5 for a litre of milk? And it's not his fault at all. It costs him a lot of money to get it. Why do we have to go to school? You know, all these sorts of things. Why is that principal coming around knocking on our door? And so building bridges between the service providers, and also the service providers sometimes don't understand the problems that are happening in communities. So getting that two-way communication going.
Sometimes the service, there can be a lot of service providers in these remote communities from all different organisations. One of the big problems you find is they don't talk to each other. So they duplicate services, they've got no understanding what each other does, they don't even know if the community wants the type of services they're offering. It's quite complex.
So getting the two broad parties, the people, community members, and the service providers, and you've also got that overlap where some of these service providers are the community members. They're not people that have come in there. They're very much a part of the community, and they're sometimes the meat and the sandwich. So getting them all talking, getting them on the same page, expressing where the difference of opinions may occur. Just to give an example of when I say give a nudge to people, so whereas in most communities, if you have a problem with, say, violence or suicide, most people would say, yep, that's a problem. We've got to fix the suicide. We've got to lower the suicide rates, for example. But they don't make the connection between, well, the low unemployment rates, you know, of having adults not working, having kids not having any aspirations. They don't make the connection between that as the problem that needs to be fixed. And once you fix that, you will likely fix the suicide and other dysfunctional problems as well. So have I covered much rest of it? So with the new input from Gar's given a lot of input, Janet, Rob, myself and John, we've all brought new perspectives to it, a lot of work's gone into it, and it's only made a much better product than what the previous already kind of good one was. Quite a quick snapshot. I can't add too much more. If there's any questions, Janet really should be here. She'd be the one to answer the questions, but I will do my best. And Ron to do. Yes, Richard.
So you're going to use the reciprocal knowledge model.
Partnership model, yep.
And you know, I see a lot on the one side of you're gathering that knowledge and getting the internal perspectives. Can you say a little bit about what you're going to do in terms of kind of quantitative Western methodology? I didn't see any.
Yeah, okay. This is a qualitative study.
Okay, so in the reciprocal model, how is that reciprocal?
Okay, putting Indigenous ways of Indigenous knowledges and methods at the centre of this. Yeah. So yes, you know, to use a term that gets overused, I guess storytelling and yarning, for example. And you know, that might be considered a bit soft, so it will be tempered with, you know, our rigorous qualitative methodologies as well, but no quantitative stuff. Yes, sir.
looking at it as a devil's advocate, as, you know, potential reviewer, I would ask, how do you know if you've made any difference? And I haven't, particularly with the nudge stuff. I mean, if you actually took the nudge methodology seriously, you could build in some measures that along the lines of what they do. And it would seem to me it would make it stronger if you could have some behavioral kinds of outcomes that.
Well, I guess one behavioural outcome is for these communities, it'll probably be the first time when service providers and clients have sat down together to understand each other and communicate with each other as equals rather than defined roles.
Well, that's not the nudge sort of stuff. I mean, I'm not saying that that isn't a great, that isn't a really important thing to do. The nudge stuff is more, you know, literate. How often do people litter when they're given messages that it's about all the bad things? I mean, that's not an example that I'm talking about. That's the kind of thing. I'm just concerned that it looks to me like a community action project rather than what ARC would consider research.
Yeah, we were aware of that, and that did come up. And, I thought we had kind of steered away from that by.
I can't remember the assessors saying anything.
No, but it was brought up the last time. I think Phil may have brought it up. Yeah.
I mean, related to this issue, so your strategy is to let the goals and the actions be defined by community members.
Yeah,
right?
not like I said. We'll be nudging them, offering a bit of guidance, because often these people become complacent and don't realise that kids not going to school is a problem. 20 people living in a house is not a problem.
Okay. So, but then to an extent, I mean, what that factually will be done is to find idiosyncratic ways differently across communities, right? So, do you have, in addition to that, do you have a let's say, common core of principles that would make it possible to reach what generalizable conclusions of some sort?
Yeah, to generalise, again, what I mentioned is community-led, as opposed to solutions imposed from the outside, raising awareness within the community about potential problems of what other well-off people are doing.
I think one of the common threads in it along that is the pro-social approach is being used. And so the pro-social approach is actually bringing everybody into the one room to identify what the problems are, to come up with a solution, and to have commonalities across the community. I mean, Reinhardt, that could be looked into. The extent of success of the pro-social process, did the community find it salient? Did the NGOs and other stakeholders find it salient? How successful was the process? I mean, that's probably something that you could generalise across the communities. Much more would be very difficult. They're both very specific communities with very specific challenges. They're two of the most challenging communities in Australia that they're actually going into to work with. So yeah, it's a bit hard without some strong quantitative instrumentation too. I mean, as you can appreciate, the outcomes can be a bit difficult. But with some good qual, I think that the team should be able to identify community-led strategies and see what's common across those two communities in terms of how they tackle it, because surely there'll be similarities and differences in their approaches.
Is one of the major outcomes the acceptability of your approach? Like in terms of what you're hoping to draw out of the yarning circles, the fact that the communities felt engaged and part of the process?
Well, we kind of assume it will be because they will have suggested things, so yeah.
Yeah.
Any other? Okay, well, if there's no other questions, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam.